Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
But God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today we're talking about Gen Z. Now, some of you wonder, now who's Gen Z? I hear so many different names for the next generation, and this talk is meant to educate you, to help you just get perspective on the new generation coming behind the millennials. There's so much talk about the millennials and their attitudes and how they think and how they're responding to faith, and now it's time to pay attention to the next generation, that generation that's currently in college. It's those who are teenagers and younger. And how are they thinking about the world? And at this point, we have some data. It's impossible to know how it all turns out, but you can start to see the trends. You can start to see what they're interested in and what they're not, how they're responding, what their motivations might be, how they think about family, how they think about faith. There's no one better to talk about this than Mark Matlock, who leads an organization called Wisdom Works, but he's also the co-author of a forthcoming book by him and David Kinnaman called Faith for Exiles. And they've done one of the largest studies to help understand how Gen Z is thinking about faith, technology, their future, how they view authority, and so many other aspects of this generation that's so unique. And you're going to find in this 9-minute talk, you're going to get a lot of nuggets of wisdom about how to think well. If you're a parent of kids who are teenagers, maybe a little younger, maybe they're just going off to college, this is for you. Share this with other friends. Share this with other parents that sometimes you're commiserating with because you're trying to orient yourself well to how to best help your child flourish. So let's listen in now.
Good afternoon, Q. We're going to talk generations. So I'm just curious, where are my millennials in the room? Born between 1980 and 1998? Let me hear you, millennials. Let me hear you. As a Gen Xer, I just want to say thank you. It was so wonderful when you guys came on the scene. It got all those older generations off our back and focused on you. So thank you. Well, I'm here to say, move over, millennials, because there's a new kid in town. Generation Z is coming of age at the time when they can take the heat off of you as you come to power. It's time for you millennials to move to the adult table, all right? So I'm inviting you there. So I've spoken about, a million or so teenagers over the last 27 years of my life, face to face. And one of the things that we found about Generation Z is some really interesting aspirations and qualities that make them who they are. I want to share with you those a little bit today and how we can best help them and disciple them in their lives. So not only is Generation Z the new kid in town, but the town is changing too. This new town is something that David Kinnaman and I like to call digital Babylon. Many Christians in America are kind of losing the comfort of what they once considered to be the new Jerusalem. And this generation is growing and forging their identity in these incredible times of change. Now, those of us who work with teenagers, we talk about the work of adolescence. And we talk about the fact that there are basically these direction-setting questions that teenagers are asking themselves during these formative years of their life. They ask questions of identity. Who am I? Questions of autonomy. What decisions are mine to make? Questions of belonging. Where do I fit in best? And questions of epistemology. What is my trusted source of truth? Now, if you were to walk up to a teenager and ask them, hey, what are you up to? They're probably not going to say, well, I'm just working out the answers to my epistemological questions. But that's exactly what they're doing every day. They're trying to find answers to these really big questions about life and who they are. And it's because they're asking these questions that generational research can be so incredibly powerful in helping us understand a generation and also how to help disciple them. So I'm going to rapidly go through some of the big trends that we saw in Generation Z in our research at Barna. And then I'm going to try and show you how we can maybe leverage those to help them as we're discipling them in this generation. So the first big trend that we saw was that Generation Z is diverse. In 2016, For the first time in the US history, the kindergarten class had more minority members than Caucasian members. That's an unprecedented shift in demographics. And it showed up in our research as well. Generation Z actually tells us that they expect and anticipate to encounter people that are very different from them on a daily basis. Now think about what that means for a generation that's going through this type of change and shifting culture when they're asking questions about their identity, about their autonomy, about their belonging, about their epistemology. It's profound. The second trend line that we saw is that Generation Z sees gender much more fluidly than other generations. 12% of Generation Z told us that they identified as being something other than heterosexual. Now, when you consider that in every research project that we've done at Barna, that number has never risen above 3% with any other generation. That shows a distinctive shift in how a generation is thinking about their sexuality. Now, if you're from an older generation, you probably never really thought much about your identity in relationship to your sexuality much unless you were a sexual minority. But for this generation, it's very different. In fact, a third of this generation tells us that they think that our gender is really based on how we feel and not having anything to do with how we were born or our anatomy. I remember when my daughter came out to my wife and I as a heterosexual. She walked into the room and she announced, "Mom and Dad, I am not a lesbian. I just thought you should know that." I thanked her for sharing that important information with us. And as she walked out the room, I leaned over to my wife and I said, "Should we have a follow-up conversation with her about this?" And what I realized was my daughter, who's on the very front edge of Generation Z, she has a new checkbox to check off when she's checking out her identity because there's a new narrative going on for her generation about these issues. And so these direction-setting questions are very important in light of these trend lines. The third trend that we see is that Generation Z is post-Christian. This is the first generation in the US that is answering these identity direction-setting questions at a time when there is a significant chunk of the US population that does not identify with any faith or religious tradition. That's huge when asking those direction-setting questions. The third trend line that we see with Generation Z is that Generation Z is career-oriented. They are children of the recession, and they tell us that their sense of self-worth and self-being and calmness is more grounded in their professional achievement than in their family or religion. They're the first generation that we've ever researched at Barna that has said that very thing, meaning that this is a distinctive of this generation. Remember that because we're going to come back to that in a moment. So David Kinnaman and I wanted to try and figure out how can we help this generation find and follow Jesus in digital Babylon. So we surveyed people who had identified as a Christian at some point in time in their life, ages 18 through 29, and 4 distinct groups emerged. The first are what we call the prodigals. The prodigals are people who said, at one time in my life, I identified as a Christian, but I no longer do. They make up about 22% of the population. Then we have nomads. Those are people who say, I consider myself a Christian and identify with that, but I'm not working my faith out in a church or a faith community. I'm going it on my own to lesser or better degrees of success. We're actually very concerned about this particular group. The next are what we call the habituals. The habituals attend church regularly, but when we ask them other questions, we find that faith is not central to their life and doesn't really inform the choices that they make. Then we have our exemplar group, which we call resilient disciples. They make up a mere 10% of the population that we were researching. These resilient disciples attend church frequently, but they also are involved in church outside of Sunday experiences. And so they are integrating their faith with their everyday life choices and decisions. So basically, we looked at these and we did a deeper dive on these resilience. And what we found were 5 really unique distinctives among them. I'm only going to talk about one today as I wrap this up, and that is vocational discipleship. Vocational discipleship is talking about the integration of our faith and our work arena. It's about our calling, and it's about right-sizing our ambitions to God's purposes on this earth. Vocational discipleship is one of the distinctives distinctives of resilient disciples. And I want to show you a graph here. And if you look at this graph, I can't go into great detail about it, but I just want you to look at that top line there, okay? You see that when it comes to how they answer and respond to these survey questions compared to the other three groups, they stand out. But let me zoom in on just one point for a moment, and that has to do with their church experience. Okay? When we asked them to tell us whether or not what their experience was with vocational discipleship at church, 72% of resilients told us that their church did a great job of helping them integrate their faith and workplace, compared to only 41% of those habituals. So knowing that Generation Z is career-oriented, we all know that our career does not make us who we are, but that our work can be an expression of how we glorify God. Vocational discipleship could be an incredible avenue and opportunity for parents in the church to help attract and also disciple this generation. Vocational discipleship could be a powerful way that we help Generation Z find and follow Jesus in digital Babylon. This generation is living in exile. And like the exiles before them, Daniel and Esther and others, exiles are instrumental to God's purposes in times of change. Let's be generations that help them do that. Let's help Generation Z be all that God has called them to be. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that talk. I hope it was informational, educational. I know it probably leaves you with still more and more questions. One of the great things that Mark and David have done for their next book called Faith for Exiles is really spell out what does it look like for faith to go forward in a new and younger generation with all of the dynamics around us today, whether it be technology, the cultural pressures, the different worldviews that have seeped into the conscience of most Americans. How do we think well about it? How do we move forward? How do we lead well in our churches and in our families? What an incredible resource. So I'd encourage you to get Faith for Exiles. Go to Amazon.com and order that. But I would also encourage you to go to QIdeas.org. And if you haven't subscribed already to Q Media, subscribe to Q Media. That's where you can watch this talk with others. You can sit around the living room with your kids and watch this talk. You can ask a few key questions. Get them thinking about it. Get them to respond and react. Are we thinking well about how they actually think? Let's find ways to come together and have more learning and conversation in community. And you can do that through Q Media. Individual subscriptions, only $7.99 a month. It's been amazing to see how many people are jumping on and starting to leverage this platform. We have churches using it amongst their teams. Their youth groups are using it. Youth pastors who are playing these talks for their students in their youth group and creating incredible conversations with them. Parents who are pulling their children together in an evening and watching a 10-minute episode of the Beatitudes series that helps them understand what does a modern day look at the Beatitudes look like. There's so many great pieces of content here. It's not just Q Talks. It's more podcasts, series. It's content from other sources. It's documentaries and things that are going to inspire you as a Christian to know how to live on purpose in this moment and how to engage culture well, being both faithful and credible in our cultural moment. So go to QIdeas.org to learn more.